letto la relazione che ci hai mandato, molto interessante. Ne ho un sacco di domande, non li farò tutte, poi possiamo magari parlarci, parlare su quello noi due, però sì, ti farò alcune domande che ho
Va bene.
Su questo. Molto interessante.
Mi sono accorto che c'era qualche errorino, Ho scritto un po' in fretta. Oggi li ho corretti.
Vabbè, non ti preoccupare, io non mi sono accorto di quegli errori, quindi... Ok, un minuto más e iniciamos.
Siamo in tanti, comunque vedo 26.
Siamo una comunità piuttosto piccola rispetto a altre facoltà o scuole dell'università, però sì, ne abbiamo,
26,
un bel numero. Ne abbiamo un bel numero tra gli studenti che sono del master e del dottorato in scienze cognitive che abbiamo qua. E inoltre noi facciamo questi eventi aperti a chiunque voglia partecipare dell'università o anche fuori dall'università.
Certo.
Ok, direi che possiamo iniziare, sono passati 5 minuti, quindi adesso faccio una spiegazione in spagnolo e torno da te.
Sí, no preocuparse.
Muy bien, buenos ya tardes a todos y a todas quienes nos acompañan en el seminario. Pues este es nuestro seminario transdisciplinar mensual que tenemos. Y antes de introducir al doctor Chiurco, que nos va a hablar el día de hoy, quisiera comentarles algunos aspectos. El doctor Chiurco me dijo que en el caso de que exista alguna pregunta a lo largo de su presentación, pueden detenerlo y hacerle la pregunta directamente, o pueden también esperar al final de la presentación, como ustedes prefieran. La presentación se va a desarrollar en inglés, porque es la lengua común que logramos encontrar. Y nada, pues bueno, sí, para las preguntas. En el caso de que existan algunas preguntas, por favor no duden en hacer la pregunta. En el caso de que no se sientan confiados en su inglés o no sientan que tienen una buena fluidez en el idioma inglés, la compañera Dulce, que la pueden ver en la cámara activa ahora, si puede levantar la mano Dulce. Okay. La compañera Dulce nos va a ayudar con las preguntas como intérprete. Va a tratar de traducir la pregunta que ustedes generen en inglés, en español, al inglés para el doctor Chiurco. De todas formas, el doctor Chiurco me dice que él entiende el español, no lo habla, pero lo entiende. ¿Okay? Entonces les pido su numerosa participación en esta actividad y yo creo que podemos dar inicio a la actividad. Voy a proceder con una introducción del doctor Chiurco. Okay, now I change to English. Okay, but I'm very glad to introduce Dr. Chiurco. He is not only a colleague from the University of Verona, where I was working, but he's also a good friend of mine. So Dr. Chiurco is Associate Professor of Ethics at the Department of Human Sciences. He was working as a civil servant in the Italian Ministry of Artistic and Cultural Heritage, and now he's working in the university. In the university from 2011, and he's working in two main research lines: cultural roots of contemporary work and theories and practices of caring. These include two topics: the philosophy of niche, in particular the figure of the free spirit, the dynamics preceding over the rise and fall of the civilizations, the concepts of resentment, health, and illness. The last are interesting for this presentation and also for the collaboration that we are trying to establish with Dr. Chiurco. Various ethical topics is a second topic related with philosophy of medicine, the ethics of caring, and intersubjective ethics. Dr. Chiurco have an important production at academic and scientific level, and he is author of different and several publications in relation to the main topics of his research. So, welcome, Dr. Carlo Chiurco, and please.
Grazie. Grazie, thank you to everybody, and good evening to everybody also. So the title of my presentation is Philosophy of Prevention. I hope Professor Sanchez Lopez has already made a text circulating among you. But anyway, now I'm going to read the text. It will not a literal reading. Okay, I will try to cut through also some part of the text in order to leave more room for the discussion later. Again, I apologize because I don't know Spanish. I can understand it, but I can't speak it. So the title of my presentation is Philosophy of Prevention. And to beginning to approach, this subject, I decided to start with Greek mythology, because it's really the myth of Prometheus provides us, with interesting basis to further develop, the concept of prevention and its ethical implication, because I would say that my presentation basically deals with two topics. What is prevention and what are the ethical implications, the ethical problems also when we deal with prevention. Why also prevention, so often fails to deliver the expected results. So the beginning of our story is, as I said, with mythology. We begin at the time of myth, where the foundations of what would later become Western civilization were laid. And the main character of our story is Prometheus. He was a titan, a deity of the ancient times before the Olympian gods ruled the cosmos, with Zeus at their helm. And Prometheus was very well known for his friendliness towards men. You know that gods and men were not so friendly at the time, but Prometheus was. And he was also the one who had molded man from clay, giving man his physical shape. According to the myth of Prometheus, at that time men were frail, vulnerable, harmlessly exposed to the dangers of a wild environment against which they had no tools to protect themselves and survive. Indeed, at that time, all the tools belonged exclusively to the gods, and this is also why gods were so superior to men in the myth. Prometheus stole from Zeus the sacred fire, his most prized tool, the tool upon which Zeus had founded his power, and gave it to men. And men from then on were finally capable to survive and thrive. And you know how it ended, enraged by the theft, Zeus ordered to chain Prometheus to a rock and condemn him to suffer a torturing eternal punishment. Every day an eagle would come to eat his liver, only to magically have it grown back every night. I mean, the meaning of the myth is clear. It's clear that his technique equals man to gods. This is the meaning of the myth. The myth, of course, is full of philosophical implication, and many of them are very helpful in order to lay down the conceptual framework for the discussion about prevention. What is the meaning of prevention? Why prevention is important? Why matter? What I mean when I say why prevention is important? Why prevention matters so much to us, to human beings? Why it is also so complicated to enact? And what we can do in order to make it work, and also its ethical implication. I would start with the very etymology of the name Prometheus, because in the name Prometheus is composed by two parts. The first part is a preposition, pro, which means in advance, before, And then you have another word, which is metis. So Prometheus literally means someone who is capable to know in advance, to use in advance that particular kind of knowledge, which is the metis. The true gift of Prometheus, the one who is capable to see in advance, consists of the true gift of Prometheus consists in his ability to foresee, but not in the way we usually consider foreseeing, just as a fortune teller, or a wizard or something like that. No, metis is not that sort of wisdom, but it is rather the ability to strike at the right time in the right place. So it is this sort of prevision. Metis is a sort it is a rational faculty, but it is not a calculating faculty. So it is more of a sort of a rational astuteness. Okay, it is not a calculating power. And besides signifying such clever astuteness, Metis was also a goddess. So there is a word Metis, but Metis is also a noun. The noun of a goddess who was one of the many spouses of Zeus. And indeed, the marriage was occurred in a very strange way. Zeus swallowed Metis so that he could become one with her, and he could become one with her power. So what was the power of Metis? Metis was credited with the power of being manifold, ever-changing, polymorph. So the power of Metis was essentially the power of metamorphosis. So the virtue named after her is the ability to successfully surf the waves of a manifold, ever-changing, polymorph reality. This is also why Metis is rational but not theoretical. It has to do with the actual fight for surviving man endlessly carries on. Every second of the word is a dynamic balance of opposing forces. An instant later, that balance is gone, replaced by a different one. So, in order to survive the endless polymorphism of the word, man has to be even more polymorph and elusive. The only way for man to survive to a word that changes constantly is to be even more changing, even more polymorph. Only by being quicker than nature, he can hope to foresee its moves and turn them to his own advantage. So this is where both prevision and prevention originate from. So they share the same gift, in a sense, the same nucleus, the same conceptual nucleus. This is where both prevision and prevention originate from. A good prevention never comes without a certain degree of prevision, while prevision per se risks to remain pointless, a mere theoretical exercise. If it wants to leave an actual mark on reality, if it wants to be effective, prevision needs to become prevention, at least to a certain degree. What are the other consequences of the myth, the philosophical implications of the myth of Prometheus? Well, the fact that Prometheus was, technically speaking, the creator of man, the one who actually shaped him in his human form, has two important consequences. The first consequence is, following the technical nature of his creator, man is a quintessentially technical being. And the second consequence, technical here, what does it mean? What does it mean to be technical? It means to be capable of metis. That is, to possess the ability to prevent the constant twists of fortune and reality's unpredictability by anticipating them through an even bigger flexibility. Okay? And the lesson of Greek mythology, as we will discover, is still valid nowadays. Prevention and prevision, though not the same, are intertwined, and they form the gist of practical knowledge. And this is something that was accepted also by the philosophical tradition that came after the age of myth. As Aristotle wrote in the very opening lines of his Nicomachean Ethics, it is the first ethical treatise of history, in the history of philosophy. Ethics cannot be approached in the same theoretical way of logic or ontology or arithmetic. Behaviors depend on multiple and various circumstances which are usually never or rarely fully predictable. Reality is approximative and not perfect. So it follows that as Aristotle says, in ethics we must content ourselves to inquire about the truth by approximation, that is, not theoretically. Similarly, the conclusions of an ethical inquiry are neither demonstrations nor theorematic, but a constant approximation to truth. So, the ever-changing polymorphism of reality needs a similar approach, not just to be practically dealt with, overcome, and turned to our advantage, as in the practical virtue of metis, but also to be successfully studied, just as philosophy's asymptotic approach to it. Just as philosophy's asymptotic approach demonstrates. Asymptotic means that philosophy strives to come ever closer to the truth, but this process has no end, no actual end in sight. And therefore, a conclusion from the Greek mythology about provision and prevention is very clear. A dominating, a calculating form of reason is not suited to tackle the daunting questions posed by prevention. And what are the questions? The questions are, why do prevention campaigns often fail? How is it possible that campaigns clearly designed for the good and the well-being of the targeted recipients either do not awake in them the desired self-awareness, or even provoke utter repulsion and every sort of confrontational responses? So, a correct, successful approach to this question lies in a way of thinking that works in accordance with the flexible, approximated, and polymorph nature of prevention as it is outlined in the Greek virtue of metis. And from now on we can come to the second stage of our analysis, which is still focused on the meaning of prevention. So, we have just learned that from the very beginning of Indo-European civilization, prevention was linked with the ability to anticipate events and behavior and to imagine multiple possible outcomes, sometimes in order to counter them and sometimes in order to favor them. We know that it is a practical virtue because, as Aristotle said, ethics are approximative and imperfect, just as reality is approximative and imperfect. But there is another fundamental reason for prevention to be necessarily practical. Why? Because anticipating events and imagining outcomes implies a strategy that works. But to which purpose? The answer to this question helps us adding another piece to the puzzle about the meaning of prevention by clarifying its inherently defensive nature. So, prevention is a strategy. To what purpose? In order to help us defend ourselves from the dangers of an environment that constantly tries to overwhelm us. Prevention is never a display of strength, an overspill of force and energy. On the contrary, its sole purpose is to minimize damage. Therefore, an inquiry about prevention itself, let's not forget, itself an approximation issued from reality's imperfection. If reality were perfect, there would be no need of prevention. It is because reality is imperfect that we need prevention. So an inquiry about prevention could not be complete without a previous clarification of its close relationship to vulnerability. and demands in turn that we thoroughly confront ourselves with our own essential vulnerability. Precisely because reality is not perfect, it is also fragile. And in the natural world, minimizing damage is a matter of death and life. Fragility is a thin line between life or surviving or death. And this is also why humanity is essentially technical, as the myth of Prometheus shows. And the fact that man is essentially technical means quite simply that he is the most fragile of all beings. All animals indeed display a certain level of technical ability, but man is the only being that has transformed such technical ability, that is his capability of prevention, in his essential feature. So man is the essentially technical being, is the quintessentially technical being. But this means that man is also the most fragile of all beings. And man has built his entire physical morphology and his entire evolution around this essential feature of his technicality. This indeed is very interesting. Of course, here I cannot, make a long digression, but there will be so many interesting things to say about, the fact that man has built his entire physical morphology around this essential feature of his being technical, of his technicality. All the reflections, for instance, of German anthropological philosophy, German philosophical anthropology, for instance, Plessner, Galen, they are all, built around this notion. But of course, here I must keep short, of course, otherwise we would never end. Without the fire of technical ability, the gift of Prometheus, man would simply die. But prevention is a double-edged sword. We need prevention.
Sorry, Carlo. I have a question before to continue, yes, because I don't want to lose the line of your presentation. You're talking about the vulnerability or fragility of the human in terms of life-death. So this dichotomy between to be alive or die. Mm-hmm. This is an important negative event in nature. So in terms of prevention, you say that the aim of the prevention is to avoid not only the illness, but the death?
Yes, exactly. Is to meet prevention, overall prevention is focused on minimize damage. So the biggest possible damage is death. Okay. And so this, of course, you could retort, okay, but is this an impossible task? No, well, but of course, prevention, the aim of prevention is not, of course, to erase death, of course, from our life horizon, but is to minimize the possibilities of death that may arise in human existence. In a sense, all of human life is a gigantic form of prevention against death. We could also see human life under this perspective.
Yeah, because I have an idea. Maybe we have different ideas, maybe about health and illness, and I can also think that prevention is the aim of prevention is to reach the well-being, for example. No? Mm-hmm. I don't know if in this idea, the idea of prevent the damage is implicit, but I don't know. I'm trying to understand this in a positive way, not in a negative way.
Yes, of course, of course. But it is not simply negative. Of course, the well-being, just as happiness for ancient Greeks, for instance, is an end in itself. So you don't simply want to reach and to preserve also your well-being simply because it helps you not to die, also because it doesn't, right? Yeah. So of course it is an end of itself. but nevertheless, this aim is deeply embedded in a conceptual framework that has to deal primarily and in a sense exclusively with human finiteness. That's the point. Okay. So this is where you see, this is where death pop-ups nevertheless, because in the end, I mean, this being is a finite being, finite in space and time. Mortality means this. It is not simply mortality is not simply linked with the fact of dying, the fact of physical death. Okay, because this is a fact just like any other. Mortality is different. Is the awareness of our finiteness. Is the awareness that our being is not infinite in time and space.
Okay, because also we have different cultural elements that can change from different societies and communities,
yes,
regarding the mortality, death, life, well-being, etc.
Of course. Also, I would say that the element of mortality is important. But why? For instance, in the context of ancient Greek mythology, the element of mortality, but also in the Christian context, the element of mortality is simply it is not a sort of ban that falls upon humanity. Okay, it is the element that distinguishes man from God, the finite from the infinite. See, I would say that mortality becomes increasingly an element of anguish and despair in the modern world. When you see that an entirely different sort of reason takes power. This sort of reason, the reason of ancient Greek, but also the reason of medieval philosophy, for instance, is not a power-fueled reason. It is not a reason made to dominate nature. Okay, its purposes are completely different. So. I would say that it is only in modern time, and of course in our contemporary time, that mortality and death, begins to possess that distinctively negative meaning that it possesses for us nowadays. I would say. Yes. Here the context is different. Of course, I mean I cannot outline it, very. With too much detail, otherwise it would take too much time. But I think that your question was more or less about this, different sort of perspective and why death. I mean, in the end, your question was about why should death be so important.
Yes, that's right.
Exactly. Your question is.
Okay, Guillermo has a question. Guillermo, are you there?
I have two questions. Is the destiny incompatible with the prevention?
Destiny is?
Yes, this destiny. Because, for example, in the myths, in the Greek myths, the destiny and the prevention are opposed one to the another.
Yes, in the great tragedy by Aeschylus, Prometheus Chained, there is this very famous line, Techne is far weaker than necessity. Techne is the technical power of man, of course, built around prevention. But it is said that no matter how powerful the power of human technique, the power of human prevention can become, no matter how powerful, an anche, that is necessity, is always more powerful. So in the end, it is always destiny that has the last word. So in this sense, prevention must be contextualized. Prevention must be contextualized. So prevention is the force that the technical ability that allows man to survive. Okay, but the distinction between the man, the human, and the divine cannot be overreached. This distinction remains. So in the end, we always remain the puppet of destiny. This for Greek mythology and for Greek tragedy. For Greek philosophy, of course, things will slowly begin to change. Because with Greek philosophy, with Plato and Aristotle, of course, these great authors will try to slowly detach man from destiny. And also from nature, of course. Man, with philosophy, man begins, to detach himself from nature. And until with modern philosophy, of course, this detachment will be complete. And then you of course, you will have, a new form of reason, that will arise. A reason that will not try to adapt to reality as Metis did, because Metis is ever-changing, just like reality is ever-changing. So you see here a form of rationality that constantly tries to adapt reality. Okay, so basically, for the ancient Greeks, technique means that in order to overcome nature, man must adapt to nature and follow the way nature behaves. For modern philosophy, it is completely different. It is exactly the opposite. The power of dominating reason exerts itself by the power of mathematical reason of modern philosophy. Needs to violate nature. This power must be exerted in a violent way. Man has the right to impose itself, and so to challenge destiny in a sense. Man becomes the titan here, not Prometheus. Man becomes the titan of himself, of course.
Okay, thank you. I think Janine had a question. Are you still in line, Janine? And do you want to express your question?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure it was the right moment, Dr. Javier, but yes. I want to know if Dr. Carlo would, contextualize this philosophical approach, Doctor, in the situation of the pandemic, because I think, listening you is very accurate the way you see,
I will.
Illness and prevention. You will. I'm sorry.
I will. So, no problem. I will.
Okay, yes, he will do that. I'm sure about that. But also Dulce has a question.
Thank you. I was just wondering if about what you mentioned of that. If you suggest in your text that men or human beings have a denial, and that's why they avoid prevention.
Yes. Well, just I will provide many examples of human denial of prevention, but these are contemporary. These are modern, of course, just like we have experienced in the current pandemics, for instance. Of course, for the Greek mythology, to deny prevention would be stupid, would be suicidal, of course, would be suicidal. And it is typically modern, and we will see, and there are some very good reasons why nowadays men deny prevention. Because this is linked with the absolutistic traits, the absolutistic features of modern scientific reason. So the rejection of prevention is the rejection of this absolutistic model of science and rationality.
Okay,
but
thank you so much.
we are coming to that.
Yeah, thank you so much. We can continue.
Okay, and so we were talking about vulnerability. So we said that prevention is a double-edged sword, because we need prevention because we are vulnerable. Okay, as we said, but as the pandemic has shown too well, the acceptance of prevention is far from granted. And it takes, we all know, it takes, only a few thousand no-vax people to jeopardize the efforts of millions. So, prevention, the only means we dispose of in order to protect ourselves from our own vulnerability, is itself vulnerable. And again, you can see a striking comparison with the virtue of Metis. Metis was capable to overcome the unpredictability of life only because it was even more polymorph and ever-changing. And prevention is no exception. It is our greatest weapon against our own vulnerability. Why? Because it is made of such vulnerability, not because it opposes it frontally. And being made of a vulnerability, prevention is radically exposed to the risk of failure. Once again, we can see that prevention seems to have nothing to do with a calculating and dominating attitude, striving to keep events in check. It rather confronts reality by following reality and adapting itself to reality. And this seems to be the secret behind a successful prevention. And this is at least the philosophy that is presently what is the philosophical inspiration that is behind what is presently the most successful approach to prevention, that is nudging. And here now I come to nudging and information that are probably the most widespread approaches to prevention nowadays. So basically nowadays, what does it mean to imagine, to plan a prevention campaign? Basically, it is about nudging or information. But before, we must say something about the dramatic turn that occurred in modern philosophy. So around 16th century, basically. So while prevention in the antiquity and in the Middle Ages was the virtue of one's careful adapting to the ebb and flow of events, the modern age saw a dramatic shift in its meaning. As I said before, before in the antiquity, prevention was basically the ability to careful adapt to reality. In modern times, it became the ability to exert power and domination on reality. The rise of scientific reason meant that calculation and domination were now on the forefront. Human reason had the power to discover the physical laws that rule over nature and to express them in the pure formalism of mathematics. The mathematization of nature meant the rise of determinism, which in turn pushed the meaning of prevention towards control, which is exactly how it is perceived nowadays in the eyes of many. That's why they refuse prevention, because to them prevention means control. Prevention practices modified accordingly, emphasizing coercion. I mean, it is not that prevention is simply perceived by many people as coercion. For the centuries of modernity, as Michel Foucault has clearly shown, prevention was coercion and became coercion because there was this paradigm shift from the practical rationality of the Greeks and the medievals to the dominating and calculating rationality of the moderns. Contemporary science has definitely parted from this modern absolutism of reason, embracing a relativistic and probabilistic approach. But the influence of this absolutistic paradigm still lingers in some scientific trends, even today. Just think of behaviorism, or some naive forms of genetic determinism. For instance, if you read the works of Richard Dawkins, the egoist gene, well, it is genetic determinism. And so these are the last remnants of this absolutistic paradigm of science. The coercion-based approaches to prevention of the past, of the modern age, as denounced in the works of Michel Foucault on the development of modern medicine and the treatment of psychic disorders, are all rooted in the absolutistic turn science experienced during the modern age, so from 1600 until the early 20th century, and produced as a result a swarm of mass anti-scientific political conspiracy attitudes, such as the no-vax movement. And it would be wrong also to think of this approach to prevention as a thing of the past, because the current pandemics has witnessed a lot of incensed reactions to the restrictions imposed by sanitary authorities throughout the world, of course. And this constitutes indeed the main problem behind every prevention campaign planning. How being effective without provoking resentful opposition from the very targets of prevention policies. The response to this problem is usually resorting to mild, gentle strategies, chiefly among them information campaigns and, more recently, the approach known as nudging. Nowadays, experts mostly rely on extensive information campaigns. So let's begin with information campaigns. I would say that mostly experts rely on extensive information campaigns. But the results, we know that are often mixed. And we have some examples taken from the current pandemic. For instance, some sort of advice, such as washing your hands often, reduces the risk of contagion. Some sort of advice seems to work. But if we see other sort of advice, for instance, the label put on the cigarettes pack, smoking produces serious damage to your health, it doesn't seem to work. And this is just as information as washing your hands reduces the risk of contagion. Another interesting data I found, a study commissioned by a pool of car insurers in Italy showed that drivers who had agreed to install on their cars a black box, a device similar to that commonly employed on airplanes. So these drivers who had agreed to install a black box on their cars reacted with surprise when data proved that they overcame, on average, speed limits more than 20 times a day. And this led them to change their driving style permanently. But remaining in the world of the car industry, campaigns tried in vain to raise awareness on the importance of fastening the seatbelts. People began to oblige only when a bill was passed, eventually making it compulsory. So we see that information has mixed results. What about nudging? Nudging is also known as gentle pushing, and it has enjoyed a certain fame of recent after the publication of the book of Thaler and Sunstein, which is arguably the most comprehensive study about nudging. Nudging basically consists of a communication technique, mixing encouragement with advice, specially designed not to raise the confrontational approach advice or comments often inspire. But again, its record is mixed. While nudging may indeed be good when applied on a one-to-one basis within certain contexts, such as education, for instance, within the educational context, nudging is indeed very, very useful, okay? But it is less clear that it works when it is applied to mass audiences, to the general public. So far, its application on a more massive scale has been only through incentives to comply with certain behaviors or to discourage other behaviors. Typical examples, again, I take them for the car industry, typical examples of incentives of nudging applied to a massive scale are reserved lanes for drivers who subscribe to carpooling programs, or facilitations to lure people to buy electric cars. And these facilitations may include tax breaks or free parking lots. And also a form of disincentive, that is part of the nudging approach are penalty point driving licenses. This is also nudging applied on a mass scale. Smart working is a form of nudging too, at least in the beginning of the pandemic, before its economic advantages for employers had become clear. It was why smart working was widely and rightly suggested as the best way to curb the spreading of viral contagion. So what is the problem with nudging? The problem with nudging, in my opinion, is twofold. Its practical records are mixed, because sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But it is also unclear whether nudging fosters that kind of awareness, which only makes prevention truly work, by inducing people to permanently change their attitude, adopting safer and wiser lifestyle. Again, we have seen that as the study commissioned by the car insurers of Italy, these drivers were shown the data about their driving style. They were surprised and they agreed to permanently change their driving styles. But as for the fastening the seatbelts, no. It took only the coercion of the law in order to push people to fasten their seatbelts. So again, we have a very recorded mix. The only certainty we possess so far about prevention is that no form of coercion, no matter how sensible, seems to work. During the pandemic, so this is the only thing we know for sure, coercion doesn't work. During the pandemic, announcements of coming lockdowns generated as a result mass rushes to catch the less available trains or planes to leave big cities, from Milan to London, from Madrid to Paris. So there was no different countries, different cultures, different lifestyle, but the same outcome. Of course, the announcement of the coming lockdown was made for the good of the people, of course. But still, the result was, this mass rush to train. And given that even those who complied with the restrictions imposed by authorities expressed reservations, or even did so grudgingly, coercion and top-down decisions simply look completely out of touch with 21st century sensitivity. Beside the overall anti-authoritarian trend of culture and society, another factor may have concurred to the present shying away from anything involving coercion, real or perceived. The melting away in the Western democratic world of true elites, of at least of anyone who can provide an example to imitate. An elite cannot expect its impositions to be effective if it does not provide an example. For instance, the case for the reduction of CO2 emissions would be strengthened if politicians, followed by businessmen and Hollywood stars alike, would shy away from jumping on and off airplanes. In this respect, Greta Thunberg, who sailed from Europe to the United States to attend a United Nations summit on climate change, may be heralding a new generation of leaders who take their pledges seriously by making deeds following words. However, even though leaders who set positive examples to follow may help to encourage people to comply with prevention, for instance on social and ecological issues, they cannot expect to be liked or admired by everybody. So this is not a solution, in my opinion. In the case of Greta Thunberg, for instance, her upper moral grounds looks contentious to many, thus eventually alienating her much support. Furthermore, we must remember that we are still living a time of divisive politics. Divisive politics are still alive and are set to stay for a long time within the democratic world. So, resorting to good leadership to foster imitation might not be such a good idea, not at least until the internal strifes of democratic societies are finally mended. And let's not forget also the fact that not just politicians are mistrusted nowadays. Populism has done an immense damage by denting at the respect enjoyed by experts in the eyes of the wider audience. There is a greater suspicion and distrust nowadays on experts, whose advice is nowadays only a bit less unpopular than politicians' decisions. Also, there are many quarrels and disputes between, for instance, virologists and epidemiologists that we have witnessed during the pandemics. I don't know in Mexico, but in Italy we had an immense rows of continuous spat between epidemiologists against virologists, and everybody was interviewed by TV. And this, of course, in the end, damaged the reputation of scientists and of science. So, to provide an example to imitate, an example to follow, unfortunately, does not look like a promising strategy in order to foster compliance with prevention. In the end, so, the problems with approaches to prevention based on information or nudging are respectively two. So the first is the problem with approaches to prevention based on information is that they lack certainty that people will choose wisely to comply with prevention activities once they got all the right information. And the problem with the approaches to prevention based on nudging are the lack of certainty that people, after being gently pushed to adopt preventive habits, will not revert to their bad customs of old. In a sense, these approaches, the approach based on information and the one based on nudging, are too optimistic about the fact that people act rationally and sensibly, always or in most cases. But we cannot, unfortunately, presuppose that people act neither rationally nor sensibly. On the other way, This is true also of all coercion-based approaches to prevention. Since no awareness and no life-changing attitude is required from targeted people in this case, because the only thing that is required is that they obey to coercion, one can never know whether people will keep behaving as expected once they step back into obscurity from the limelight of control, or whether if they will do exactly the opposite out of repulse from the constraints imposed on them. And so we come to the most important ethical part of our analysis, that is the aporia, the contradiction that seems to lie at the heart of prevention. Because prevention works only if people agree freely to it. But it takes a deep and thorough education in order to push people to change their lifestyles to such extent. But such goal, in turn, seems extremely difficult without resorting to a sort of dulling of the I, a relaxation and a weakening of their sense of individuality and self-determination, with which we can fall back with which we come back full cycle to the problem of freedom. So the problem of prevention is it works only when people freely agree to it. But in order to make people behave this way, you have to educate them. So in a sense, you have to weaken their sense of self-determination. To weaken, in a sense, their sense of the I. You have to relax it in a subtle way or in a less subtle way, with which we come back to the first problem, the problem of freedom. So how is it possible to escape this vicious circle, the contradiction of freedom that is stuck in the very heart of prevention? In order to move to the solution, we have to introduce another essential element. That is the element of desire. The element of desire. If we look, if you remember what we just said about, information and nudging, we said that they are too optimistic because they presuppose that humans are essentially rational. Indeed, if the prevention based on information and nudging share a feature, they are pure strategies. But prevention, in order to work, needs more than just strategy in order that it may achieve its goals. It takes desire. In order to understand why prevention efforts sometimes fail to deliver the promised results, even when they seem at reach, and why designing prevention actions is always so difficult, desire is key. So basically, we need a different conception of the human being. That's the point. Indeed, it doesn't seem too far-fetched to state that a good prevention campaign needs a thorough, comprehensive planning as badly as an imaginative, empathetic identification with its targeted recipients, and not just in terms of imagining their needs. Because again, desires cannot be reduced to needs. Human behaviors seem less irrational and unpredictable if we consider their provenance from beings that are not just rational, but also and essentially desiring ones. Desire, and not reason, is indeed the source of human acting, as well as the power behind it. We act because our will pushes us to do so, because we desire to do something, and sometimes because we desire something. Reason only comes to provide guidance to our actions, so that they may achieve their projected purpose, and sometimes to question them, to question our actions, on moral grounds, but reason never inspires action. This awareness about what constitutes humanity was the foundation of Greek, Roman, and medieval ethics, but it was forgotten and lost in modern philosophy, which envisaged humans as purely rational beings. This awareness about the desire as the main constituent of humanity re-emerged strongly with Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and Freud. Western culture is still uneasy about the power of desire. For instance, if you consider contemporary philosophy, you see that there are lots of works emphasizing the importance of emotions, but relatively few emphasizing the importance of desire. Only French authors such as Jacques Lacan, for instance, Gilles Deleuze, these are the authors, that following Spinoza and Nietzsche put desire as a philosophical and psychological production about emotions. But emotions are extremely important, of course, because they have been the object of a fierce repression, especially during the Victorian age and particularly in the Anglo-Saxon cultures. And indeed, if you see all this, for instance, Martha Nussbaum, they are all Americans, of course, because it is important for Anglo-Saxon cultures, to liberate, in a sense, the expression of emotions. But emotions are not so powerful. I would say they are not so fundamental as desire. Why? Because emotions are always referable to the I. Even when they overwhelm me, they are still mine and no one else's. Desire, however, is never mine, nor it partages with emotions the same cause-effect relation they share with the outside world. When I am struck by a loss, I grieve. When I got an unexpected chance, I am happy. When nothing happens, boredom owns me. So there is a cause-effect relation. Emotions are, in a sense, the mirror, the mirror that provides the link between me and the outside world. But where do my desires come from? And are my desires mine at all? Did Alexander the Great desire to conquer the world because of family problems? And why did Julius Caesar desire to emulate him? Indeed, we might be tempted to think that we begin to desire something to accomplish great deeds, for instance, because we imagine to employ our desires as a solution, as a tool, as something that gives significance to our lives or helps us overcoming our difficulties or helps us imagining new possibilities for us. But in all these cases, we would be fooled because desire is never a solution, let alone a rational one. The harsh truth is that even if we love to imagine our desires as the tools that may help us to achieve self-realization, it would be more correct to say that we become enslaved in and by our desires. We become obsessed by them, so that they rather employ us to fulfill themselves. Desire is not rational, so it does not make sense to think of it as useful. Indeed, all utilitarian paradigms, when applied to desire, melt away. They are reduced to impotence. Strategies are inherently utilitarian, and these explain their insufficiency when it comes to win hearts and not just minds, for the sake of effective prevention. Prevention campaigns should learn from games. Games, like desires, cannot be squeezed within utilitarian paradigms. Understanding the full meaning of games is one of the most serious and difficult philosophical problems. However, two things emerge clearly. True games So when I say true games, I mean true games and not true games that is spontaneous, just the games of children, okay? True games are deprived of formal motivation.
Carlo? Is there a question in the chat?
Ah, sí, okay.
Juan González. He say,
what if desire is a mere romantic epiphenomenon that masks underlying drives in humans, such as emotional, cognitive dissonance, avoidance, behavioral demands, and social expectations, among others, which, if taken together, can afford to do without desire as a hidden mental entity? I would say that this list of explanations is a list of causes and effects. Emotional, cognitive dissonance, avoidance, behavioral demands, social expectations. So this all tries to reduce desire. Of course, we can choose another term, of course, if we don't like desire. But for instance, we could use the term drive. The term drive. So drives, for instance, are drives provoked or simply awakened? For instance, a particular sexual drive I feel throughout my life. Would you say that it is provoked for instance, from the primary scene of Freud, because I see my parents, sleeping together? Or does this scene simply awake this drive? I mean, when I read a list of, for instance, social expectation, whatever, these are just attempts to explain rationally, of course, a phenomenon just like desire. I wouldn't say anyway that desire is an epiphenomenon, because you probably, or rather, we have to make a distinction between individual desires, okay, which are, of course, epiphenomenal. For instance, my desire to buy a new phone, every time that Apple, produces a new model of the iPhone, I have the desire to buy that new model. So this is definitely an epiphenomenon that can definitely be explained, okay? But desire is something different. Desire, in ancient philosophy, desire was simply known as will, voluntas. Voluntas. So desire is much more of a driving force, I would say, a driving force that is very general. When we talk, for instance, of very singular desires, such as the desire to buy the compulsion to buy new shoes or whatever, new clothes or whatever. These epiphenomenal desires are indeed driven, not driving forces. But desire as a driving forces is something completely different. And I wouldn't say that it is something that it is something that no reductionism may eventually squeeze into a single category.
Okay.
And I wouldn't even call it a hidden mental entity, and because a mental entity, I would rather see it as the main tool by which desire expresses itself, or finds the way to express itself.
Okay, he say if you then translate desire into the reasons for acting, as it has more or less traditionally been, or there's more reasons as will, for instance.
Desire is, I would say, an unreason to acting, an unreason for acting, and the point is that you can find a reason for acting only within acting. Finding a reason for acting is indeed a form of acting. So if you find a reason for desire, you are already desiring to find it. So in this sense, desire is really transcendental. It's really unescapable. But if we want, I mean, we can find some equivalent terms. For instance, desire can indeed be, in my opinion, quite similar to acting, for instance, in this transcendental way I just outlined, or will, if you want, or driving force or living force. Can be desire reduces by fear, or by other desires. Verter und perder. Verter is what is Spanish?
What is better if we have a
okay, better. Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
yes, now I
the correction, the automatic correction. Yeah.
No. Desires cannot be reduced by to fear. No, it is more fundamental, because in the end, fear, for instance, fear is a desire of survival. Fear is a desire to live. Fear is a force in the end that, so it is a desire to survive, for instance. So I would say the desire is more pristine than fear. Fear as the force that allows us to try every possible solution in order to survive. I would say that fear is again a particular form of desire, the desire of survival, which is extremely strong. But desire is not simply desire cannot be, because there is also desire of dying, for instance. Desire can be also equally, and it can be equally strong, the desire of death, just as the desire of life. So death or life are probably simply the directions. Imagine desire as a force, in a physical concept. So simply the direction following which this force flows may be either life or death. But life or death are again ways of way by which desire manifests itself.
Okay, thank you. Juan González say grazie.
Grazie, Juan. So we were talking about games, right? Games. So desire is very similar to games. True games, as I said, it's very difficult to understand the meaning of games. But two things are clear so far, and they are: true games have no formal motivations. True games have no goals. Okay, so games are simply played for their own sake. They are ends in themselves. If you apply statistics and the theory to the theory of probabilities, if you ask to gamblers, okay, to apply statistics and the theory of probabilities to gambling would disappear instantly. We play games, as I said, as ends in themselves. And when we do so, and this is what is really interesting, when we do so, when we play games, just like as children do, we enter a region of openness. Öffentlichkeit, I take this these remarks from the works of Eugen Fink, German philosopher Eugen Fink. He says this, and it's very interesting. When we play games, we enter a region of openness where we expose ourselves. Okay, so in games are an immense occasion, an immense force for us to reveal ourselves, our true self, in a way which is extremely remindful of the meaning of action as theorized by Hannah Arendt in The Human Condition. There is a very close, you remember The Human Condition by Arendt, when you act in public, when you speak in public, which is, for Arendt, of course, it is the most important political act of all. You reveal yourself. And so the same goes for games. And the same goes for our desire, of course. Desire is the best way for us to reveal ourselves. And desires are ends in themselves, to the extent that fulfilling our desires can become the task of our lives. Desire then teaches us the most important lesson about prevention: never follow a reductionist approach. Reductionism means that everything is measurable and quantifiable. However, desire is essentially mismeasure and challenges every attempt to quantify it. Because humans are desiring beings, by extension, they enjoy the same features of desire, which implies they cannot be simply reduced to thinking machines. More than simply unpredictable in their reactions, then, human beings are unmeasurable, non-quantifiable. As a result, prevention cannot simply be the outcome of a strategy, but must involve the human beings as a whole, by carefully taking into consideration the desiring part in them, hidden within the human beings. And now I come to the last part, where I confront with their respective ethical implications, two approaches: the utilitarian approach and the axiological approach. You remember that we said that prevention comes with an aporia, a contradiction. And this contradiction is the contradiction of freedom, because prevention works best when it achieves a permanent change in the lifestyle of people. But how to push people to behave in a certain way without curbing their self-determination, and in this way putting prevention's very effectiveness in jeopardy? It is important to note that the ethical dilemma of prevention is not simply a side problem. So there is not the practical problem of the effectiveness of prevention, and then as a side problem, okay, the ethical dilemma. No, they are the same thing, and they must be solved together, okay? Then here I have made an example. So what could be an utilitarian approach to solve the problem, the contradiction of freedom in prevention? So prevention works only when people freely agree to it. But how to push people to agree without curbing their freedom? That's the point. So two possible utilitarian solutions. I will go faster here because I simply use this term as example. Two typically utilitarian or consequentialist approaches to solve this problem, this contradiction, could be either enhancing human moral abilities through genomic editing, or by resorting to artificial intelligence. What is the difference between consequentialism and axiology? It's very simple. Consequentialism does not believe in good or justice as normative values in themselves. Consequentialism thinks that values are defined by the consequences of actions. If I consider the consequences of an action, of a moral choice, as good for me, for my community, or for mankind, then they are good. Very simply, this is the consequentialist approach. And it is clearly an a posteriori criterion, because first we must act, then see the consequences, and then judge the consequences. If I deem the consequences good, then the action is good, is morally acceptable. Axiology, on the contrary, is an a priori criterion, because axiology believes that values should be normative. So it exists a good, it exists justice, okay? So, as a consequence, in the axiological perspective, some actions are intrinsically good or bad. And we must use the principle of precaution to guide our action, okay? So these are also not just two different ethical perspectives, but also two different juridical perspectives. So the Anglo-Saxon word, of course, is consequentialist, so it follows the principle of observation. So let's observe the consequences of an action, and then let's judge it, if it's good or bad, okay? On the contrary, and this, of course, has also influenced the American Anglo-Saxon juridical approach, for instance, in biotechnologies, okay? Whereas, for instance, European legislation, continental European legislation, follows the principle of precaution, which says, before acting, you don't have to wait for the consequences of the action to judge whether it is good or bad. But good or bad, are axiological principles, so you have to take them into consideration before you act. And European legislation is completely different, for instance, because it has inspired the Convention on Biodiversity, signed in 1996 in Rio de Janeiro, which forbids every human intervention that has not been demonstrated to be fully risk-free. What was the approach before? The previous approach was to forbid every intervention that had been demonstrated risky. The principle of precaution says every intervention that has not been demonstrated to be completely deprived of risk should be forbidden. Okay, so you see that these approaches are completely different, and tellingly, the Convention on Biodiversity has not been ratified by the United States, because you see there is a completely different cultural approach. So, these possible consequentialist solutions to the ethical dilemma of prevention. The first, enhancing moral abilities through genome editing. This is a solution that has been recently invoked by these two authors, Persson and Savulescu, in order to overcome the obstacle known as evolutionary egoism. It seems that we humans have developed a very tribal moral sense, basically restricted to our circle of proxies. And so this makes, problems such as, for instance, the tackling climate change, saving the planet for the future generations so difficult, because we cannot develop empathy for future generations because we don't know them. They are far beyond our circle of proxies. So, in order to make humans more empathetic, okay, we could use the genome editing. So that, for instance, we can produce more hormones that, may help us, they may limit our egoistic behavior. What is the shortcomings of such technique? Well, it is very clear. such intervention would certainly limit egoistic behavior, but it would not exclude it, of course. And second, of course, there is another problem with this approach. A portion of humanity, the programmers, would, have the right to program the rest of humanity. But of course, these people are just as flawed as all the others, of course, all the rest of us. And so we would be in a situation where a restricted circle of flawed individuals would decide the fate of all. And so instead of solving the aporia of freedom implied by prevention, genome editing would make it worse. A second possible solution could be resorting to artificial intelligence, which is subtler. Artificial intelligence has an enormous power of calculation, and so with this power of calculation we could solve all the problems of prevision, thus letting authorities to devise the most effective response in advance. This would not interfere with the freedom of individuals, who would remain free to behave as they wish. It would only affect the unpredictability of their behavior. I mean, people would still remain free to behave as they wish. Artificial intelligence would simply calculate the more likely outcome of their behavior. So there would be no limitation nor constraint, neither physical nor psychological, applied to any individual. So what are the problems with this approach? The objections should indeed focus on what artificial intelligence actually is and what is not. At least for now, and arguably for many years to come, artificial intelligence is not capable of an all-encompassing look on man as a whole, but it must necessarily limit itself to his surface. Machine learning, so far, can pay attention only to the single dysfunctional elements. For instance, not wearing a face mask in times of pandemic. But we, as humans, behave dysfunctionally. As humans, we are dysfunctional, not as single elements out of a context, okay? But only as a whole. We are wholly dysfunctional. Artificial intelligence does not possess a tridimensional, holistic gaze, but only a flat view. It sees only partially, probes with great effectiveness the surface of our humanity, our behaviors, in our example, but not its depth, thus leaving aside the wider dimension of our dysfunctionality, our drives, our desire. For the same reason, while artificial intelligence can decide freely within a given framework, because a certain degree of randomness is already incorporated within its programming, this does not match human beings as beings essentially lacking measure. To state that we, as humans, display a behavioral unpredictability is simply a failed attempt to transpose our essential mismeasure into the language of statistics. Humans do not simply behave random. They rather lively experience randomness. This is why they sometimes act instinctively, for instance, deciding to give their own lives up so that others may survive according to their sense of responsibility. It is indeed a very interesting experiment. Artificial intelligence, if you have an experiment and you put two sinking cars, in one car you put an adult man, and in the other car you put a baby, and you say circumstances allows you to save only one of the two, okay? Artificial intelligence saves the adult man. Why? Because he's stronger. He's stronger. His lungs are capable of more air, of course. The baby is weaker, so he has less probability of survive. A human being instinctively would choose to save the baby, because this is very interesting, because this is precisely because we don't simply behave random, but we experience randomness. It is an entirely different order of meaning. And now to the end. So what could be an axiological possible solution to the contradiction of freedom that lies within the prevention? Okay. So we must make, it's very clear, we must make prevention desirable. So we have to take desire into consideration when we plan, when imagine prevention campaigns. We have to take desire into consideration as the most essential feature when we imagine and plan a prevention campaign. All utilitarian approaches to prevention, in the end, try to bypass human freedom and self-determination, or they try to reduce human unmeasurability to something quantifiable. Sometimes they work, as shown by many examples. For instance, the example of, the money withdrawing cards, to contrast the phenomenon of customers' carelessness, which led to thousands of withdrawal cards forgotten by people in machines. Banks have found a very simple way to invert this trend by obliging customers to withdraw the card before getting the money. If cards are easy to forget, money is not. Such strategy sums up very well the utilitarian approach to prevention. It consists of a strategy. It is capable to win minds but not hearts. It relies on some sort of constraint, mild as it may be, imposed on self-determination, and involves a certain reductionism of human unmeasurability. Its most common consequences include, first, a superficial comprehension of humans, because, as the example of the man drawing out of his responsibility and caring for the others shows, utilitarianism is only one of the many approaches and perspectives on existence humans may assume during their lives. And two, winning minds but not hearts. Since every consequentialist approach is capable to win minds but not hearts, it may not lead to the sort of durable changes in attitude and lifestyle that usually arise from a state of newly reached awareness, which are the goal of prevention. So, a possible axiological model could be the so-called relational autonomy, which is a model that has been devised to provide a response to bioethical questions such as end-of-life treatments and advanced directives. The problem, is the problem of end-of-life treatments is very, very, very clear. What medical treatment I can refuse to be applied on me in case of vegetative coma? The problem here is to reconcile the intrinsic value of the human person, symbolized by my right to self-determination, with the need of ensuring that my decision will be taken in a responsibly way. I will always retain the last word on my fate, to the extent that I could even refuse to hear a medical advice. I could simply say, no, I don't want. And I don't even want to hear an advice, whatever, I don't care. My decision is simply no. Nevertheless, this model works best when there is an active cooperation between the patient, and the physician. In other words, only when the decision about one's fate is taken after having received an informed advice from an expert, it may be deemed truly responsible and therefore truly morally acceptable. And here we see at work a different model of autonomy. This is why it is called relational autonomy. This is not a political model of autonomy. The political model of autonomy is entirely centered on a subjective need of self-affirmation, which is important, of course, but it must be used in political contexts. Here, we must, for instance, in order to defend, to stand up for the rights, to defend the rights, to tackle social issues, and so on. But here, we should really use a different sort of autonomy, the so-called relational autonomy, which is an ethical model, not political. What really matters in this model is the active cooperation between the prospective patient and the physician, the relation that takes place between them. The moral good here occurs within the relation and as the relation. The good in the relation between the patient, in the cooperation between the patient and the physician, is not something that comes outside, that adds, to the relation coming from outside, but is the relation itself that is being established between the two. Without such relation, without such cooperation, the self-determination of the patient is not fully accomplished. It simply remains the imposition of a self-sufficient, self-referential, sovereign will. Of course, I can say no, because it is in my right to say no, and nobody questions this. But is this right to say no pure and simple, a perfect moral accomplishment? No. We must realize that our true self-realization occurs only within our relation to others. Our true self-realization only comes as the good relations we are capable to establish with the others. And this is the reason why such ethical model is called relational autonomy. It is different from the political model of autonomy, of course, because it comes a time when you simply have to stand up, and then this very affirmative model, this affirmative action, this self-determination as pure, sovereign, self-referential, self-affirmation is needed. But this is a political model, not an ethical one. So there's the difference between the two. And it is precisely this ethical model of relational autonomy. Why relational? Because you remain fully autonomous. You are still the only master of ourselves. But you exert your autonomy in a relational way, by creating a relation with someone else. So the advantages of this of this ethical model to solve our problem are clear, because no coercion is exerted here, since individual self-determination remains absolutely intact, nor it is bypassed implicitly or explicitly. But here the subject freely chooses to cooperate because it understands the centrality of relation as the essential element of human growth. Unfortunately, we live in fragmented societies, rife with all sorts of individualism, social, economic, and political, where self-affirmations, sometimes necessary to address matters of social injustice, overshadows a dialogical, relational approach. However, prevention does not become desirable simply by virtue of the advantages it supposedly brings, but only when it strikes the deepest cause of our humanity. Relation is what makes all of us truly human, though we may realize it, unfortunately, only when it is too late, when we need relation the most, as when we are most fragile, ill, old, or dying. Terminally ill patients agree that a man's greatest fear lies not in death, but in realizing that so far she or he has lived a life deprived of true significance, which only relations may provide. And prevention is no exception. So if we will succeed promoting the ethical model of relational autonomy, addressing prevention for what essentially is a relation between human free subjectivities, people will comply with prevention more eagerly and more responsibly, with no need to bypass or constrain their self-determination. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Carlo. It was really, really interesting. And your talk matched with one of my research line related with the prevention in two main fields: the prevention of the cognitive decline in adults, in older adults, and the other line is the prevention of sexual transmitted infections. So it is really interesting. So I have many things to talk with you, but maybe we can discuss in the future because it will be long. We have some minutes for some questions. So Guillermo,
there is one, I see. We try to generalize. Most, if not all, of what you said applies, I'm afraid, only to human animals. But in naturalized epistemology, we try to generalize conclusions to different life forms, perhaps including artificial life, considering that cognition is not the exclusive lot of humans. There is no problem for me with that. And I mean that the main point of my presentation has been that cognition is not the essential lot of is not the essential lot of humans. I mean, not rational cognition, at least. Question: to what extent do you think that natural sciences, and in particular cognitive sciences, should inform and interact with philosophy in order to claim knowledge and or reach ethical decisions? Well, I believe that for cognitive sciences, and not just cognitive sciences, but also, for instance, there is a particular branch of neural studies which is called neuroethics. I think that philosophy nowadays cannot be properly done without prior establishing strong ties with the scientific world. For instance, I make this example. For instance, if it is clear that moral decision, and it is clear from cognitive sciences, for instance, it is clear that moral decisions never come without involving also the emotional sphere. Okay, so philosophers should take this into consideration. For instance, if you are planning to writing a new moral theory, for instance, you have to take this into consideration. You cannot be like Kant, for instance. Kant says that, you know, in order to exert to behave in a proper moral way, you need to cut the emotional sphere off entirely. So if cognitive sciences say that, tells you, and not just cognitive sciences, but also neuroethics, for instance, says that the emotional sphere is invariably involved in decision-making processes. So a philosophical theory like that of Kant makes no sense, is impossible. So you have to take into consideration the discoveries and the results of scientific research. Otherwise, I mean, the problem is that you risk to theoreticize for the sake of itself, but your theories are not applicable because for the very simple reason that are not designed for human beings. That's the danger, of course. As for your the first part of your question, I agree with you. I never said that cognition is the exclusive lot of humans. Probably rational cognition is, probably. I'm not sure about it, but it wouldn't be. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it eventually turned out that it isn't. Okay, so no, and yes, I see another raised hand by Guillermo.
Juan wants to reply.
Yes, sorry.
I'm sorry. I don't want to take a lot of time about this, and thank you for your answer. Just wanted to say that I'm not saying that you said that.
Okay.
that animal cognition or artificial cognition is not of your concern, but I have a very hard time trying to apply what you said in terms of desire, in terms of values, into some other domains, non-human domains. So you didn't say that, but I think that it is kind of implied in what you said that you cannot go about with an ethical theory in other domains than humans, because it's very basically impossible to talk about desires in other animal forms, or values and so on. So that's what I meant.
Okay. Yes, it's true. It's true. This is it is very difficult to imagine an ethical theory designed or styled around, but also there is an ethics of exoplanets, for instance. Now, how could we imagine that different life forms living in different planets or solar systems or whatever could imagine values, would they use values or don't? I mean, no, it's this is true. This is true. I would reply that so far on this planet, on planet Earth, we seem to be the only species that is concerned by ethical questions. So, quite humbly, I would rather content myself to solve the ethical problems for ourselves, and later to apply them to other forms of life. It would be enough.
Yeah, and it will take a lot of time, probably. Okay.
Guillermo.
Thank you. I see a possible problem in the relational model that you do, because if physicians have their desires too, and the information or the knowledge that his opinion of the situation is modeled by his own desires, and if the desires of the physician is not in the same way that the patient desires, what the desires ruled, what can we do about that? Thank you.
I wouldn't say that this is a problem. I would rather consider this an opportunity, because I would say that every human relation, every intersubjective relation, is basically a conflict of desires. I mean, a good relationship, a relationship that works, is a relationship where the two subjects involved in the relationship have been capable to to find a way for their desires to live together or cooperate together even better, or at least not to interfere with each other. So I wouldn't say that the perfect identification of the two desires is a required element in order so that the relation may actually occur. Quite the opposite. I would say that human relations are born precisely out of conflicting desires. Sometimes, of course, sometimes the conflict between desires can escalate and become truly violent, and then it is when you have relations of hate, of course. But they are still relations. They are still relations. Of course, we cannot call them good relationships that, that we can cultivate, but still they are relations. The point is that it is impossible for human beings to live outside of the relational sphere. We are literally made of relations. That's the point.
Okay, we have time for the last question by Lisandra.
I see.
This is a controversial question.
Do you consider that a high educational level is required to be able to respect prevention in situations, for example, such as the pandemic, wearing masks and respecting social distancing, among others, because certain people won't accept preventive measures, except if those are applied by force? I know. People need to understand what has been happening so they can willingly accept such measures. This is a very, unfortunately, this is a very hard question. Why? The problem is that, of course, you cannot force other people to believe in the very evidence you put under their eyes. Okay, of course, you are morally obliged to do whatever is in your power in order to persuade them for their good, of course, for the sake of their good, of course. But if you see that they don't want to be persuaded, then of course, I mean, you cannot resort to force. Never. You cannot resort to force, because otherwise you fail to respect their right to self-determination, their subjectivity, and so on. It takes education. I don't know, because for instance, there is among the supporters of conspiracy theories, there is the scientist, the French scientist who discovered the AIDS virus. He's a negationist too. Luc Montagnier, Robert Gallo, no, Luc Montagnier. So he's for sure a very educated person. He's a Nobel Prize winner. Still, he came out supporting no-vax conspiracy theories, saying that COVID-19 virus did not exist. It's only a gigantic fake, instrumentally constructed by governments in order to keep people in check, blah, 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 blah. So I would say that, of course, I'm not saying that people should not be educated. Of course, education plays a part. But for instance, what can we infer from the behavior of a Nobel Prize winner behaving like this? Okay. We see that the rational cognitive element must be educated, but here there is certainly a lack of emotional education. There is a complete lack of balancement. There is a complete lack of balancement in these cases. So I would say that education is very important, but we should, by this term education, we should mean it in a very wide way. So education means education to learn. There is a figure we use in moral philosophy very much, and it is the blossoming of the human being. The ultimate goal of ethics is the blossoming of the human being. So I would say that education is less about, possessing skills, possessing knowledge, possessing abilities. These, of course, are important, but if they don't lead to the blossoming of the human being, they have failed. So the case of the French Nobel Prize winner, feels the urge to call a press conference to state in front of all cameras that COVID-19 is fake, it does not exist. I would say that this is a case of failed human blossoming. Because and you are also a scientist, so you are twice responsible of your words, of your deeds also. You know what evidence-based means. So how can you deny such thing? Because you let, some emotional strike overwhelm you. I don't know which emotional strike, if the need of being in the limelight, the need of having a microphone put in front of you and the cameras put in front of you, I don't know. But clearly here we can see an emotional strike at work. Overwhelming reason completely. Because he's a scientist, he knows what he's talking about. So he cannot deny the existence of a virus that can be seen in a microscope. Clearly here there is something else at work. So education, to end my reply to your question, education, yes, but we must, education is not just about learning skills, knowledge, and acquiring abilities. Education is ethical education. Because, for instance, okay, you believe that COVID-19 does not exist, but if you have an ethical education, you know that your words matter since you are a Nobel Prize winner. So, for instance, you could think twice before call a press conference in order to express your ideas about it. So I would say rational education, cognitive education, ethical education, and emotional education. These three aspects always come together. And in our educational systems, I would say that we disproportionately stress the importance of the cognitive education, that is acquiring skills, competences, abilities, and so on. The rest is left, to some strange guru tell you that no, you have to develop your emotionality, denying your rationality, and so on. That's the problem. That's the problem.
Okay, thank you so much. Juan Gonzalez shared with us this information regarding related with this talk regarding the compulsory COVID-19 vaccination in France. So it absolutely is related what we are saying.
L'Académie de médecine française vient d'approcher faire un plan de vaccination rapidement obligatoire dans un communiqué glaçant dont le titre révèle plus une campagne de communication qu'une production scientifique. L'administration séculaire clame. Obligation n'est pas un gros mot quand il s'agit de vacciner contre la COVID-19. As I said, the coercive approach is always is always alive. But see, also, this is very I mean, this is typical of a country like France, for instance. I mean, with such a strong centralized state, a deeply entrenched monarchical tradition. Jean-Philippe has tweeted the because I'm criticizing France.
Yeah, of course. Okay, unfortunately, we finished the time, so we are over. But I want to say thank you so much and in acknowledge to your participation.
It's been a pleasure to be with you.
For us, it's a pleasure. So I want to share. Yes, Juan, do you want to add something?
Just say thank you. Thank you. Very stimulating talk.
Thank you very much.
Here I have a certificate for you. I would like to read the certificate in Spanish, obviously. El Centro de Investigación en Ciencias Cognitivas de la Universidad Autónoma de Morelos otorga el presente reconocimiento al profesor Carlo Chiurco, Universidad de Verona, por su valiosa participación como ponente en el Seminario Transdisciplinar, impartiendo la Conferencia Towards a Philosophy of Prevention, Cuernavaca, Morelos, at May 26, 2021, por una humanidad culta, una Universidad de Excelencia, and by Dr. Javier Sánchez Lopez, myself, head of the Cognitive Psychology Lab. So thank you so much, and I hope we can continue with this discussion in the future.
Me too. Thank you very much again. I was very happy with you, and hope to see you soon, maybe in person. Why not?
When you want. And I will visit you in Verona. Okay.
Exactly.
Thank you so much. I will send you the certificate in a moment.
Okay, thank you.
And good afternoon for everybody in Mexico, and good night for you, Carlo. See you the next.
Va bene. Buonasera.
Ciao, buonasera, grazie tante.
Ciao.